Welcome back, everyone. Today we are joined by John Mearsheimer, professor at Chicago University, to discuss grand strategy, offensive realism, and try to link this to events in the world. So thank you very much for coming back on the program.
As always, Glenn, I'm glad to be here.
So, everyone now seems to recognize that, well, we live in somewhat historical times. That is, the international distribution of power, it's shifted from the west to the east very fast, which is quite remarkable for having occurred during peace times. Now, we see that the unipolar moment is over, and even on a greater time frame, we can argue that a period of 500 years has come to an end since the European maritime powers reconnected the world in the early 16th century, and to different degrees organized the world under its administration ever since. Now, the response in the West, and I would say especially Europe, to these massive ongoing shifts now in the international distribution of power, they tend to be they tend to be these narrow knee-jerk reactions. They don't really reflect much upon how the world has changed, how our position in the world is changing, and they don't really take a step back and assess what are our options and what should our objectives be to maximize security, prosperity. So I guess in short, there's an absence of strategic thinking at a time when we need it more than ever before. So what I really want to discuss with you today, as I said first, was if we take a few steps back and we begin with grand strategy. Uh, I guess I want to ask you, what is grand strategy, and what do you see being the main challenges, I guess, in terms of aligning potentially unlimited aspirations with limited means?
Okay, let me define for you what I mean by grand strategy, because as you know well, Glenn, you can define grand strategy in different ways, and there's no such thing as a correct definition. Definitions are just definitions, and you can define grand strategy any way you want. My view is that the best definitions are those that are most useful for helping you make sense of the world. Uh, so, in other words, you could define the term great power to include Iran. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think that makes sense. And I don't think it does. That's not to underestimate the power that Iran has, but it's not a great power. So I would want to have a definition of great power that I thought included countries like the United States, China, and Russia, but excluded countries like Iran. But the basic point I just want to make clear to the viewers is that there's no such thing as an approved solution as to what the definition of grand strategy is. Now, when the Vietnam War ended in 1975, which is when I was entering graduate school, there was all of a sudden a huge interest in the subject of grand strategy. It had not been a subject that was talked about much in academia up until the mid 1970s. And then a whole cottage industry grew around that subject. So, in a very important way, I was present at the creation. And we uh, came up with what I thought was a quite useful definition of what grand strategy was at the time. And I still think it's a quite useful definition, especially if you think about how great powers act. And what I'll do is I'll just quickly lay out my definition of grand strategy. And to make it as clear as possible, I'll contrast it with how I would define foreign policy. In other words, I distinguish between grand strategy and foreign policy. Now, my definition of grand strategy is that it's all about balancing a state's most important foreign policy goals. To put that in slightly different terms, its vital interests with the military means it has available to achieve those goals. So, in other words, you have to first define what are the most important foreign policy goals, the vital interests, and then you have to think about what military means you have to protect those goals. And foreign policy, for me, doesn't discriminate among your goals. You can have lots of different foreign policy goals. What I'm saying is that grand strategy is all about looking for a state's vital interests. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? There, the question is, what areas of the world are worth fighting and dying for? Where are you willing to expend blood and iron? Those are the vital interests. And to get way ahead of myself, in the case of the United States, the vital interests outside of the Western Hemisphere have historically been Europe, East Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Those were the three areas where almost everybody agreed we should be willing to expend blood and iron. We should treat as vital interests. But a foreign policy deals with interests all over the world. Now, with regard to the military means, you have to make all sorts of choices about what kind of means that you want to deal with when you're protecting those vital interests. And diplomacy is another means, right? Sanctions is another means. But what people of my persuasion argued back in the day, and most of us still do, is that you want to look at the kind of military forces that you would build to protect your vital interests. And to put a little more meat on the bone, you have to choose between land power, air power, and sea power. And then you have to think about how much you're going to rely on nuclear weapons versus conventional weapons, or to put it in slightly different terms, how much you're going to rely on nuclear deterrence versus conventional deterrence. So, what I'm saying, Glenn, is for me, grand strategy is all about figuring out what a state's vital interests are. What are the most important areas of the world? Those areas of the world where you're willing to fight and die. And then what kind of military forces do you build to defend your interests in those areas? Now, there's one question I've left out of this analysis, which I'll just turn to now. I said you have to identify those areas of the world that are of great importance. The question I left out that you want to throw in is what are the threats to those areas or threats to those interests? Because the particular nature of the threat determines what kinds of military forces that you build. So when you boil this all down, there are three big questions you ask if you're doing grand strategy. What are your vital interests? What are the threats to those vital interests? And then what kind of forces do you build to protect your interests around the world? So that's the basic framework that a number of people who I hung around with, starting in the mid 1970s, employed as a definition of grand strategy. And again, it's not an approved solution, but I think it's a very useful definition for thinking about the subject. And again, as I tried to make clear, it's different than asking the question, what is a state's foreign policy? Because if you're talking about a state's foreign policy, you're talking about all of its goals, all of its interests, not just its vital interests. And you're talking about all of the instruments that it has available to it, not just the military instrument, which I'm focusing on when I talk about grand strategy, diplomacy, sanctions, so forth and so on. So I hope that's sort of a good template of how I think about the general subject. And then if you want, I can tell you how I think it applies to the United States.
Yeah, well, that was actually my next question because, again, the United States, it has to start to make more priorities, especially, again, as the distribution of power shifts, it has to focus on and prioritize some things above others. Or to use your words, what are the priorities for the United States in terms of what it's willing to fight and die for? What is worth fighting and die for? I mean, Is it security, or is it its position, its power in the world? And well, at the moment, the US does face, well, we can say challenges, that is from to its power, at least, from China, Russia. Of course, the Middle East is also, well, seemingly being reorganized. How how do you see the challenge for the United States in terms of prioritizing what to focus on? And there will always be trade-offs, given that there's limited resources. And again, as you said, the need is to prioritize as we come to everything. So how, not necessarily what the US should do, but what are the dilemmas it's facing here?
Okay, let me tell you uh, what I think the four areas of the world that the United States really cared about and how to think about those areas. And then we could talk a little bit about the threats to those areas. Uh, I think there is no question that the most important area of the world for any great power is its backyard, its neighborhood, or the surrounding area. And all of this is a way of saying that in the American case, the Western Hemisphere is the most important area of the world. There's just no question about that. It is our backyard. Uh, Nevertheless, because the United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, it's usually taken for granted that the United States considers the Western Hemisphere its most important area, its most vital interest. So, in other words, people don't talk much about that. And what people do talk about are the areas outside of the world that the United States should care about, because that's where its vital interests are located. And in this case, historically, the two most important areas have been Europe and East Asia. And the reason is that's where the other great powers are. And the United States has always cared about those areas where there are other great powers, because smaller powers really can't challenge the United States in any meaningful way. It's just the other great powers. And if you look at Europe, of course, that's where you saw countries like Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany. It's where the heart of the Soviet threat was located. It was in it was in Eastern Europe. Uh, and then, of course, East Asia mattered greatly because of Japan mainly. And today it matters greatly because of China. And it's very important to understand, Glenn, that for the United States, over the course of its history, going back to when it got its independence in 1783, and I would say ramping forward to about 2017, again, for almost all of America's history, Europe was the number one area outside of the Western Hemisphere. And East Asia was always number two. And the reason is because the great powers in Europe were more powerful than the great power in East Asia, which was Japan. And you remember that even though the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, we had a Europe first policy. And the reason that we had a Europe first policy was because Nazi Germany was a greater threat to the United States than Imperial Japan was, because Nazi Germany was much more powerful. After 2017, for the first time in our history, the most important area for the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere is East Asia, because China is by far the most powerful, great power on the planet besides the United States. The Russians, as you know, are the other great power. The Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, those are the three great powers. But the Russians are the weakest of the three great powers. China is really a peer competitor of the United States in almost every sense of that term. So, for the first time in American history, East Asia has become the most important area, and Europe is of secondary importance. Now, the third area that I haven't talked about is the Persian Gulf. This is not the whole Middle East, just the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf has been a very important area for the United States for most of the 20th century and up till today, because that's where the oil is. And oil is such an important resource for making the international economy work. So the United States has always cared greatly about who controls the oil in the Middle East, or let me put it differently, who controls the oil in the Persian Gulf. So that's why when we talk about grand strategy, and my colleagues and I have talked about grand strategy in the past, we've said there are four areas of the world that matter. First of all, the Western Hemisphere, second, Europe, third, East Asia, and then the Persian Gulf. Now, the big debate that has always taken place in the realm of grand strategy was, how do you think about the developing world or the rest of the world? In other words, do you compete in areas where there are no great powers or there is no oil? For example, does Africa matter to the United States in terms of its basic vital interests? And the answer that someone like me would make is no. What about an area like Southwest Asia, India, Pakistan, that region of the world? During the Cold War, was that an area worth fighting for? Was it strategically important? And the answer was no. And I would argue the answer is still no today. It's hard for me to imagine the United States expending blood and iron in Southwest Asia. Okay. Now, the best example to illustrate this, Glenn, is the Vietnam War. And to compare how Americans thought during the Vietnam War, from a grand strategic point of view, with how they think today about Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was where, or is where, Vietnam is located. And during the Vietnam War, basically all of the realists argued that it was remarkably foolish for the United States to fight in Southeast Asia, to fight in Vietnam. It made no strategic sense at all. And as you know, virtually all of the realists of the day, including people like Ken Waltz, Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, just to name a few, were adamantly opposed to the Vietnam War because it was in Southeast Asia, and the Soviet Union was not physically located in Southeast Asia. In fact, the Soviet Union was located in Northeast Asia. So when the United States fought the Korean War in Northeast Asia, which is right next door to the Soviet Union, everybody understood that Korea was a strategically important area to the world, and it made strategic sense for the United States to contain the Soviet Union in Northeast Asia. But that logic did not apply in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia was not considered to be of vital interest by most realists or students of grand strategy. However, if you look at Southeast Asia today, because of the rise of China and the fact that China is the state that the United States cares the most about today in East Asia, and it's not the Soviet Union like it was during the Cold War, you now have a situation where the United States considers all of East Asia a vital threat, a vital interest, and considers China and Chinese hegemony in East Asia as a threat to American national interest. So you can see that you have to think long and hard about what areas of the world you consider to be vital interests. Then you have to think about what the threats are to those interests. And then you have to think about what kind of military forces to build to deal with those threats.
Yeah, I guess that's the problem of doing also security in terms of complete zero sum. Also, when it's defined as defeating adversaries, because if the U.S. now is facing defeat in Iran, as you said, then they would have to lean more into tactical nuclear weapons. You see the same in Europe, though, when they started to acknowledge that they will likely be defeated in Ukraine, and the U.S. is pulling a bit back from the continent. suddenly you hear like the Germans, the Poles suddenly starting to flirt about nuclear weapons. Same as in Asia. I mean, if China gets its will that the US pulls out of Japan, for example, the Japanese might lean into nuclear weapons instead. So, you should be careful what you wish for. Of course, the same applies for Russia. I think the whole idea that, pushing Russia into a corner, escalating, and assuming that it only has the option of capitulating, I think not. I think as well they will then only go up that escalation ladder, and yeah, I think that's what we're seeing now. But anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just say we live in very dangerous times. No question about that. Your point about Japan reminds me that Vladimir Putin recently visited the southern Kuril Islands, which the Japanese say belong to them. And this, of course, angered the Japanese greatly. And this just tells you that relations between Japan and Russia are terrible these days. And this is in large part because the Japanese have sided with the Ukrainians against the Russians. Uh, but also, the North Koreans recently launched a missile that landed in the waters just to the west of Japan. And furthermore, Japan and China have terrible relations today because of some comments that the Japanese prime minister made that enraged the Chinese. So here you have Japan that has significant problems with Russia, North Korea, and China. And at the same time, the United States, which is supposed to provide a security umbrella, certainly have its nuclear umbrella over Japan's head, has pulled forces out of Japan, out of South Korea, and has pivoted away from Asia in recent months because of the war against Iran. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the lesson that the Japanese are going to learn from that? And then this gets to the whole question of possible nuclear proliferation in Japan and the whole issue of where that leads. So you can just tell all sorts of stories today about how things are getting worse and worse rather than better and better, not just in the Gulf and in Ukraine, but also in East Asia now. So we are in a lot of trouble in a lot of different places where the potential for disaster is very great.
Yeah, also Putin make the point that from now on they will start to seize ships of the Europeans, given that the Europeans have engaged in piracy. So as you said, it's all spiraling out of control. It's just usually you would see with huge shifts in distribution of power, a new order would only be established after a great war. That is when everyone's been bled out. That's when we can sit around the table and accept to, well, reset the board, if you will, and come to some compromises. It's just you would hope that there would be some great power diplomacy where all our leaders would meet and try to work out something before we all, bring out our guns. Fortunately, there's not much historical precedent for this. So, anyways, as always, thank you so much. I appreciate it very much, your perspectives and your views on grand strategy and especially offensive realism. So, thanks again.